Hey, good morning once again, FCF. We're continuing in our study in 1 Peter. We're in chapter 4. We're going to pick up today in verse 12 and 13. Peter says, "Dear friends, do not be surprised at the painful trial you're suffering, as though something strange were happening to you, but rejoice that you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed." Two short verses with a lot in them. Now he starts off by just saying, "Dear friends, don't be surprised at the painful trial you're suffering." The theme of suffering and going through trials has been all through 1 Peter. It starts in chapter 1, verse 6. It says that the believers were going through lots of different kinds of trials, but they were to focus on their heavenly inheritance. So we're to consider suffering as Christians, as followers of Christ, and because of being Christians, as normative. This is something that doesn't, filter in very well in our thinking today. We kind of look at it like, well, if I'm on God's side and God's on my side, why should I be suffering? Everything ought to be going my way. But we're told continuously in the New Testament, and the whole book of 1 Peter, frankly, is pretty much aimed at preparing Christians to know God is still for us, God is still with us, He's still working in us, He's still working through us, even though society may be antagonistic toward us and we may go through sufferings, painful sufferings. So he says, "Dear friends, don't be surprised at the painful trial you're suffering, as though something strange were happening to you." Verse 13. "But rejoice that you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed." Now, the sufferings are called the sufferings of Christ. And so he's talking about not just everyday sufferings like, oh, wow, I got a toothache. That's not necessarily suffering for Christ. He's talking about sufferings that Christ himself underwent and sufferings that we undergo because of our affiliation with Christ. So let's think about some of the sufferings Jesus underwent before he ever went to the cross. He was constantly challenged in what he taught by the religious leaders. They tried to trap him again and again. They even insinuated that all his motives were evil, so much so they said that he did his miracles in demonic power. So they put the worst construction on Jesus' deeds. They put the worst construction on his words. You had Judas, who was a traitor from the beginning. So Jesus had lots of sufferings, not to mention the sufferings that when his disciples would at times be very slow in learning and very slow in trusting in who he was, even though they had seen his dramatic miracles. We suffer today typically by our association with Christ. Sometimes it might be that our reputation, somebody that once liked us and thought highly of us, they find out we're a Christ follower, they might not think so highly of us anymore. We might suffer vocationally in family. It is not unusual that certain family members that once perhaps were close to us, now because we're following Christ, they may feel very antagonistic toward us. And so we can suffer in lots of ways because we're associated with Christ. Now, the key is this. The Spirit of God is telling us these things are normal. Don't be surprised by those. Contrary to being surprised, he says, rejoice in those. Right in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. So this causes for you and I to do a real pause on our mental processes, because typically when we start undergoing some kind of unjust suffering or something we think is unjust, or we start being attacked simply because of our association with Christ or some good deed we've done in doing the will of God, it's misconstrued or the worst construction is put on it, our mindset doesn't go directly to rejoicing. We usually get a little discouraged. We may even get angry. We may get retaliatory. And so this calls for a different way of handling sufferings. We Christians have to remind ourselves, wait a minute. If I'm suffering, first of all, it's normative. It doesn't mean God's abandoned me or he's angry. Secondly, I should rejoice in this because I'm suffering because I'm becoming more like Christ. I'm openly identifying with Christ. I am doing the will of God. And if I live in a world, or if I live in a series of relationships that are going to punish me for doing the will of God, I shouldn't feel badly about that. I should actually rejoice, because it's indicative that my heartbeat and God's heartbeat are now, finding rhythm together. I hope that you're not going through any of those sufferings this week, but if you are, I hope this encourages you.